Good morning, everyone. It's really lovely to send this recording, and I'm really excited about our evidence session that we're going to have next week. My name's Becky Willson, and I'm project manager at the Farm Carbon Toolkit. And I'm here today to talk to you about some of the work that we do with farmers in terms of doing carbon footprinting and helping farmers understand where greenhouse gas emissions are being produced on the farm, and then also the work that we've been doing as a partnership project, looking at how we measure, monitor and manage soil carbon. So as I said, I work for the Farm Carbon Toolkit. We're a farmer-led organisation that was set up back in 2009 to really try and provide practical help and advice for farmers in terms of how to manage greenhouse gas emissions. So looking at areas on the farm where you can reduce emissions through looking at how you do manage your animals, your grassland, your fertilisers, your fuels, all those sort of things, but also very much paying attention to what we do in terms of soil management and grassland management to make sure that our most precious resource that we have in the farm in terms of our soils is managed in a way which doesn't just support resilient businesses, but also safeguards that health of the soil for future generations, and also for what we're talking about today, how that plays a crucial role in terms of enhanced carbon storage and additional sequestration. So we have a range of tools at Farm Carbon Toolkit. We have the carbon calculator, which allows you to calculate your on-farm carbon balance. So that's areas on the farm which are producing emissions, and also areas on the farm which are generating a sequestration value. And then we also have a toolkit which explains what you might be able to do to change that in a lot more detail. But then we also run a range of special projects. And as I say, the soil carbon project I'll talk to you about in a minute has been one that we've been working on with farmers up and down the UK to really understand what we can do with soil carbon. But I suppose, why am I sitting here talking to you this morning? But also, why are we interested in soil carbon sequestration at Farm Carbon Toolkit? Well, we're interested because it's a conversation that we've been having with farmers for about the last 10 years. And especially we've noticed over the last sort of 12 to 18 months, a lot more conversations that are focusing on the importance and the potential for soil carbon sequestration to provide a climate solution and to provide one of those positive opportunities for farmers to be able to contribute to the discussions and the actions on climate change. But from a farmer perspective, it's a crucial part of how we manage greenhouse gas emissions and carbon on the farm. So it's about how we can alter our management to safeguard and protect the existing carbon stock that we have on the farm, how we might be able to adapt or change our management to optimise any additional sequestration or any additional carbon that we can store on the farm. But it's complicated, and there are ongoing discussions about the capacity of our soils to hold carbon, the capability of us as farmers to optimise and maximise that ability to be able to hold additional carbon, and how we calculate it. And all of those are things that we're trying to look at. If you add into that, over the last few months, we've got an increasing more interest in the ability for how we can develop and craft financial instruments around carbon payments, focusing on voluntary offsetting schemes, how that aligns with future ELMS payments, and how there might be alternative sources of income for farmers from companies outside who are wishing to use that as a way to offset their current emissions. But also how we then split out how we account for soil carbon in terms of whether we do it on a measurement-based system or a model-based system. But overall for us, I suppose, at Farm Carbon Toolkit, we're really passionate about the fact that soil carbon sequestration is a key part of any on-farm carbon account that should be included and also promoted so that we have develop an enhanced understanding of what the potential is. If we look at the area of carbon footprinting and how we detail and understand our carbon account, very, very simply, a carbon balance, which is what a carbon footprint calculator creates, totals up all the areas on the farm which are producing emissions and then takes away from that areas on the farm which are holding carbon. So that might be your trees, it might be your hedgerows, it might be what's happening within your soil to give you your carbon balance. And whereas there are a few different carbon calculators out there, and again, happy to discuss that when we meet up next week, for most carbon calculators, including any level of soil carbon sequestration, is a very, very new thing. And those calculators that have started to develop these programs and these systems for measuring it over the last few months all work on a model-based system. So it's a mathematical model that's been developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it can be used to understand, based on practice, how much additional carbon you might be sequestering or storing in your soil, depending on those practices. Now, it's predominantly focused on arable-based systems at the moment, so the move over to more mineral tillage systems, for example, the use of cover crops, all of those sort of practices have a number associated with them. Our system slightly differs from that in the fact that although there is a model that sits behind it, we're very much focused on a measurement-based approach. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But it's really important to get your head around the fact that when we're talking about carbon footprinting, we have to be able to differentiate between the existing carbon that's held within our soils or within our sort of on-farm biomass that's there as a result of historic management, and any additional carbon that we've pulled in as a result of our direct management that can be genuinely used as to balance out those emissions that have happened in that year. It's really important that we protect that existing carbon that exists within our soils, but we can't use that every year as to balance. We've got to look at where we can generate additional carbon sequestration, and that's what can be used. But at FCT, we're also massively passionate about soil carbon because soil carbon is at the heart of what drives soil health. So even if you're not interested in soil carbon sequestration from a climate point of view, there's been some great work that's shown that if you can improve your soil carbon, then you can actually help drive resilience and profitability and productivity in your fields, so in your crops, in your grass, and your other things that you might be growing. And that's because soil carbon is really at the centre of our sort of sustainable soils management systems. So it's a crucial part of our soil's chemical balance. It's some of those founding parts for how our soil biology functions. And it's a key part for soil aggregation, so how our soil particles are arranged and how those are all stuck together, and whether there's a good balance there of air and water. So it's incredibly important. And so I'd like to just share a little bit about what we've been doing over the last 3.5 years with the Soil Carbon Project. And the Soil Carbon Project has really been brought about to really try and understand 3 key aims. Firstly, to understand, how do we measure soil carbon? There's a multitude of different tests out there and lots of conflicting opinions and objectives sometimes in terms of the best way to test for soil carbon. Has been seen to be too complicated in the past as well. So our first objective was really to try and understand what is the best way to test for soil carbon. And really linked into that, are there any proxy measures that can be used? So can we link soil carbon levels with improved soil structure, with improved water holding capacity, with improved biological or worm activities? What's the best time of year to test? What lab do we send it to? All of that sort of information, which again, happy to discuss if that's of use. Secondly, to then say, well, now we know how to test for it. What are those management practices that make a difference? And then finally, and really importantly, how do we then bring that back round in terms of understanding the potential for soil carbon to contribute to that sort of reduction in overall emissions from a farm and their net carbon balance? So really trying to understand and really dig a little bit deeper in terms of the capacity and the potential for farms of all different systems and enterprise to be able to build soil carbon, looking at the impact of depth, looking at the impact of whole different sort of sets of parameters that you guys as farmers are having to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And really taking this research out onto commercial farms that are operating out there in the real world under the sort of auspices of the weather and everything else that we get thrown at us to really understand what works. We're testing a range of parameters. So we're testing soil organic matter and soil organic carbon at 3 depths. It's really, really important to understand what's going on at different depths as we start to sort of watch at where that carbon is situated within that soil profile and actually start to try and unpick whether we're able to start to transfer some of that more sort of active cycling carbon, which tends to be quite high towards the surface of the soil down to more long-term stable carbon, where it's less likely to be released back up into the atmosphere, which obviously we don't want to happen. And those are being done, as I say, at those three depths, 0 to 10, 10 to 30, and 30 to 50. We're then testing a range of other parameters in terms of looking at the importance of clay percentage within your soil and the ability of those soils to be able to hold on to additional carbon. Looking at the importance of carbon to nitrogen ratio, so looking at that balance there, which is really important if we consider the wider farm footprint in terms of the ability of us to be able to start to look at fertiliser applications, which are a key part of nitrous oxide emissions. Looking at total organic carbon content, looking at in-field variation. As I say, our partners at Northwick are very much focusing on looking to develop that spatial model in terms of where the best place might be within the field to take those samples to take account of that in-field variation. And then also looking at inter-lab comparisons, so looking at the different analytical techniques that the labs do. At 3 points in the field, we're also looking at proxy measures. So we're looking at soil structure, we're looking at worm activity, we're looking at infiltration, we're looking at aggregate stability, and then we're looking at biological activity. So that's what we've been doing and we're continuing to do. What have we found? Well, we found that in terms of testing, the best time to start testing these sort of things was sort of 20 years ago. But the next best time to start is probably today. It's really important if you're going to go through that process of doing some tests to really start to think about developing a consistent approach. So quite often a question that I get asked is, well, what's the best test? And it sort of depends if you've got any tests previously. If you've done something previously, it's worth, if you can, trying to stick with the same lab, using the same method as you've had previously. So same lab is really important. Also really important to make sure that those tests are done at the same time of year. So if you tested last year in March, make sure you test this time in March as well. If you really want to get super accurate with it, you can GPS log your points so that actually when you go back and revisit that field, you can resample the same points across the field and be really consistent in terms of your depth of sample. So for grassland fields, what it can be quite interesting to do is to actually split out your samples and take two sets of samples. So one that's going on just in the topsoil and then one that's slightly deeper down, especially if you're starting to plant more of those sort of deeper rooting species, which actually are going to start having much more rooting activity and microbial activity further down the soil profile, to see whether those are starting to pull some carbon further down. We've also found that actually soil aggregate stability, or you might have heard it referred to as the slate test, is a fantastic proxy analysis for looking at soil carbon. So there's a really good relationship there. And again, aggregate stability or slate testing can be done really cheaply with no need for any expensive equipment, and it doesn't need to be sent off to the lab. Grab a handful of soil, leave it to dry for a couple of days and submerge it in water and watch what happens to it. And if your soil sticks together, a bit like dunking a biscuit in a cup of tea, if that soil particles stick together, that shows or it indicates that it's got a high soil organic carbon content. And if it sort of slumps and just goes a bit like a sort of bits of biscuit that you find in the bottom of a cup of tea, that's got a low carbon content. And so that's a really good visual way of assessing how much carbon is in your soil. So just to sort of summarise in terms of what we found through this project, and it's not finished yet. We're very fortunate the fact that we're able to continue monitoring some of the sites for the next 5 years. So we're going to have a fantastic data set. And the lovely thing now is that we're able to try and really start to delve down into some of these management practices in a little bit more detail. But some of the things that we have found so far, we can measure soil carbon. So although it's complicated, and although, as I say, we're dealing with complex biological systems, we are able to do it. We've also found that farmers can build soil carbon. So that's really important. But what's really, really important alongside that, and the caveat, I suppose, is that it's not just a case of saying, I've got 10 hectares of grassland, therefore I'm doing a good thing. Grassland is essentially very regenerative in terms of its ability to improve soil health. But how you manage that is incredibly important. So it's not just a case of saying this habitat or this landscape type is doing it. It's how you manage it. And it's really important when we go back to talking about that whole farm carbon footprint to try and consider those practices that reduce emissions and improve soil health. So we're going to be having lots of outputs from this project in terms of a best practice manual as to how to take samples, integrating the results of this project into the carbon calculator, but really trying to develop that evidence base that can be used to develop impact and build confidence. Thank you ever so much, and I look forward to carrying on the discussions.